All right, guys, so I've got quite a few questions about my bow building tools and the different tools that I use, why I've selected these tools, and how I use them. And so I'm just going to go through everything that I've got here and talk about why I like these things and how I use them. I'll show you some examples on how I'm using these things. But to get started is a good draw knife. Now I got this little draw knife here from a fella named Maverick Murdoch out of Montana. Makes great knives if you're in the market for a knife. And he made me this draw knife. I think this is the first draw knife he's ever made, but I absolutely love it. It's a great knife. The blade on this thing is about 7 inches, which is about as small as you'd want to go for a draw knife. You start getting smaller than that, and when you get a wide stave, you're going to bust your knuckles up. And so I'd say 7-8 inches is about as narrow as you'd want to go on a draw knife. The draw knife, when I first started bow building, I would build just about the entire bow with just a draw knife and a farrier's rasp, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And so if you're just getting started and you're going to be working on staves, a good draw knife and a good farrier's rasp or some sort of big aggressive wood rasp is, I'd say, really the only 2 tools you absolutely have to have. So I use this thing from everything from getting the bark and sapwood off to, and I actually use it as a scraper. I turn it up on edge and use it as a scraper for tillering. My farrier's rasp. So these things, you can find these online. You can find them at farrier supply. So farrier, if you're not familiar with that term, it's a horseshoer or take care of horses' feet. And these things will run $25 to $30, something like that. It's got a fine side and it's got a really aggressive side. I use this for shaping up my limb tips, my nocks, my handles. I'll do some tillering with this. These things, the fine side of these rasps come in really handy if you happen to get some washboarding from scraping on the belly. You can take those washboards out with that rasp before you go any farther. Those are my 2 primary tools. Those are the things that I use the most. When it comes to cutting in my nocks, I've got a hacksaw here, and it's got a little carbide blade. Now this blade is pretty small. It's not going to be big enough for your strings to fit in, but it cuts very well. I really like this blade. And then to finish the nocks off, I just use a 1/8 inch standard chainsaw file. Obviously a pencil for marking areas, like if you're tillering, you're going to want to mark the areas where you have a hinge starting to develop so that you'll know not to take more wood off of that area. You'll need it for laying out the bow, drawing your side profiles and all that stuff. I use a pocket knife or a sheath knife a lot for scraping, especially towards the end of the tillering process. You want to take off a lot of little fine scrapes. My saw, the saw that I use is made by a company called Silky. These saws are bar none the best saw I have ever made. It's a Japanese made saw. It is extremely sharp. So if you get one of these, be careful with it because you will cut the end of your finger off if you're not careful. It's got a very thin kerf on it, so you're not taking out a lot of material when you saw. I use that for sawing in or cutting in my arrow shelves, sawing off the end of staves, whatever I need a saw for. That's my go-to saw. I use a bow square a lot to check my tiller, whether I've got a negative tiller, a positive tiller, even tiller. I check that by just putting this on the bow's belly and measuring the gap from the belly to where the string rests when I've got the bow braced. It also obviously is going to come in very handy when you go to set your knock points. But then also I use this to figure out where my arrow shelf is going to be perpendicular to my string. So I'll pop this onto my string and then I'll draw the base for my arrow shelf before I cut that in. I use a heat gun a lot because I do a lot of Osage, and Osage reacts very, very well to dry heat. When you get Osage hot, it turns into a spaghetti noodle. You can bend that stuff into just about any shape you want. And I can't remember what I paid for this. It wasn't much, 40 bucks maybe, but you can pick that up at Home Depot or online or wherever. I've got a little arrow scale here. This really isn't bow making, but I use this a ton when I'm making arrows, make sure all of my shafts are matched, and just figure out what total arrow weight is. And then as far as measuring the weight, the draw weight of a bow, I just use a standard bathroom scale, and I've got a stick here with a notch cut in the end for the string to fit in. And then I've measured from the deepest part of that notch down 27, 28, 29, and 30 for different draw lengths. And I'll just set this on this scale, hook the bowstring in there, and then pull that down after everything's zeroed out to whatever my draw length is that I'm building that bow for. And that is going to give me the draw weight of that bow. So one of the tools that I've just recently, within the last year or so, started using a lot is a little compass and a fine-tipped Sharpie. I use this for scribing an approximate depth for my limbs. And what that allows me to do is it allows me to get the belly and the back perfectly parallel, even on a real snaky stave. You can take your rasp, after you scribe a line, you can take your rasp and go right down to that line, and man, it works out perfect. Your back and your belly are just absolutely parallel, so that you can avoid thick and thin spots in your limb. So my tillering rack setup is just I've got a pulley down here at the bottom, I've got a cradle up here at the top, and then I've got a rope. Obviously during the tillering process I use this a ton, and I've shown this in a previous video, but I'll just kind of go over it again. Where I've got this cradle, it's behind this board right here that holds the bow. It's rounded off because I want that bow to be able to rock back and forth and react to where I'm pulling this string from. I don't want a squared off platform for that bow to set on, because when it's sitting in your hand, you're not going to have a rigid block for that bow to set on. So I want it to react just like my hand does. All right, so this I've also shown in a previous video. This is my form that I use for doing recurves, and it's basically 2 5/8 pieces of plywood glued together, and then I've got the center cut out so that I can clamp anywhere along this thing. And it's got multiple options for different degrees of recurve, so I can flip this thing over whichever way I want and use whatever part of the form to get whatever kind of recurve I want. And as far as clamps goes, I've got a bunch of C-clamps that I use, but I really I like these DeWalt clamps here. They slide, they've got a little quick release right here. You can do it with one hand. These are great for your initial clamping. You're not gonna be able to put a tremendous amount of pressure. I mean, if you're really cranking on something, like if you're bending a bow at a thick spot of the bow, like a handle or something, you're not going to be able to do it with this clamp. You'll have to have a C-clamp where you really put a lot of pressure down. But these are great for recurving thin limb tips and things like that, because you don't really need to apply a lot of pressure. And so that's about all I use for bow building. Obviously you're going to have sandpaper and stuff like that, but as far as the primary tools goes, what you see is what I use. So I'm constantly uploading new photos of bows, new videos, bow building tips, things like that to my other social media feeds on Facebook and Instagram, and you can find me at Clay Hayes Hunter. And I'd also encourage you to go to my website, twistedstave.com, and sign up for the mailing list, because I put out a new video or a new blog post or something like that every week, and most of the time I'll send the blog posts out to that mailing list, so you'll get a direct email letting you know when I've got new tips and new blog posts up. So with that, we'll see you next time. Good luck on your bow building.